Hey gang, I've been asked to make a custom pickguard. This is for the gentleman whose guitars we modified with those sound ports recently, and he's quite happy with that. He's noticed a big improvement, he's enjoying it. And he's got this pickguard on another of his guitars which he really likes the shape of, so he made a rubbing for me, a tracing, to use as reference, which is nice. So we're going to do that, and we're going to do it in wood. And of course, wood isn't usually your first choice when it comes to pickguard material, for a couple of reasons. The first being is if you're a vigorous strummer, you're going to tear it up pretty quickly. It'll end up looking like Willie Nelson's guitar. The other thing is a solid piece of wood glued on top of a spruce or cedar soundboard. They move at different rates, and you can have cupping or warping, just not all that stable in these dimensions we're talking about. However, I'm going to make a laminated guard out of 3 pieces of veneer. I'm going to stick them together with epoxy, so it should be more stable. And I've got this beautiful piece of burled walnut here, which we're going to use. And for those of you who aren't familiar with burl, it's an interesting condition that happens in certain trees. I think there's a genetic component to it. It seems to be more prevalent in certain species than others. Where the bud eye formation goes kind of haywire, and you end up with these great big swirly patterns of all kinds of little buds, and a lot of figuring. And you've probably seen trees that have a great big knob, or almost looks like a wart on the side of them. That's a burl. And highly prized for generations by cabinet makers. There's a lot of fine furniture uses burl veneer in it. So hopefully it'll make a nice pickguard too, and I think it will. So this stuff here, this is walnut. And I don't use a lot of walnut usually in my work because it makes me itch, but I think it'll be okay for this job. First thing I'm going to do is make a template so that we can sort of check out the grain patterns on this thing and figure out what's going to be our face. Some really beautiful stuff going on up here. Now I don't have the guitar in question in my hands at the moment, but when it was here I took some measurements. The most important being the diameter of the rosette, because I want this guard to come up and meet that, and it might be different from the one on the guitar that he's traced. Turns out that it's 127 millimeters, so I've divided that in 2, and to get my radius here, so I'm just marking this at 63.5 millimeters. I'm going to make a little template so we know exactly how round that sound hole is. And no, it doesn't match up perfectly, so it's a good thing we did that. I'll just amend the template a little bit. We're going old school. I'm using carbon paper. For cutting thick card like this, I sometimes like using this curved scalpel. It seems to follow along better. Now I can move the template around and use it to visualize what the end product's going to look like. Ooh, that's nice. Yeah, I like that. Almost looks like tortoiseshell. Now I'm going to cut this out oversized. I'm not going to mark the interior. I'm going to actually use these straight lines here. It's going to be easier to glue together, and at some point I'm going to want to sand this, and to do that I'm going to want to either glue it or tape it flat to a surface. It's just easier not having to deal with all these convoluted forms. So I'm going to cut this out. I'm going to cut to the outside of the template. So we got the first one, that's their show surface. Now for the other 2 plies, I can use the less spectacular wood, and I'm going to flip-flop it so that I'm going to have the grain running in different directions. Actually, that would make a beautiful pickguard too. Lots of light passes with the scalpel. If you go too heavy, you'll end up splitting it. Should take 5 or 6 passes to get through. Been using the System 3 cold cure epoxy recently. It's good stuff. It dries really hard. And it's a 24-hour epoxy. So a 2-to-1 ratio. Something that people who are only familiar with 5-minute epoxy often don't understand is the slow cure stuff, the 24 hours, you've really got to mix it. You've got to incorporate those cross linkers in there. Otherwise, you'll end up with an inferior bond. You'll end up with like soft spots in it, or it won't cure properly. So, 2 minutes is not too short. Gotta get it good and mixed. I've made a little book here with my 3 sheets. One of them actually has a split in it. I don't worry too much about that because it's going in between 2 other solid pieces, and the epoxy is going to hold it all together anyway. So I made a little book. And the other thing about this is it's pretty, like I was saying, it's pretty liquid. It's going to seep into the pores. And if you think about wood like, burl, it's got an awful lot of end grain poking up at you. And this will penetrate right through. Like, I'm going to use vacuum pressure to glue this together, and it'll suck the epoxy right through the pores of the wood. This is about 20/1000 of an inch thick, which is a ½ millimeter. And so we're almost like plasticizing this wood in a way. It's not going to behave like wood anymore. Just an interesting admixture of wood and plastic, which is kind of what we want. So at this point I realized I made way too much epoxy, which is always what happens, but now I gotta go run around and find, some other places that I could use it. You wouldn't want to use wood glue for this, like Tight Bond or something. You're putting an awful lot of water into it, and no matter how careful you are, usually what happens is one surface will absorb more than the others, and as it dries, it'll be wet for longer, so as it cures, it'll curl up on you. So I'm going to put that together. I'm using wax paper to protect the surface in my vacuum clamp. I'm going to use a block of wood here, just a piece of MDF, so a good flat surface. The vacuum press is just a great big plastic bag, and inside is this laminate faced piece of particle board. The grooves cut in it allow the air to escape from underneath things like this platen. It all gets sucked into a hose. So we've got the full weight of the atmosphere pressing down on top of this thing now. Perfectly even pressure. It's good for this kind of thing. It's basically what a vacuum bag was made for. And you can actually see the epoxy is being drawn right through the surface, right through the wood pores. And it's on top here. So that's why I'm protecting it with the waxed paper. Okay, so I'll just let that sit for several hours. The vacuum is set for auto cycle, so if it loses vacuum it'll turn on again and maintain pressure. I'm covering the backside of the Pickguard with some masking tape, which I will squiggle liberally with some medium viscosity super glue, and stick that down on this nice flat board. What's nice about the board rather than the surface of the bench is I can flip it around if the grain is running in the opposite direction, so I can get a good angle on it for planing. So I'll scrape it and then sand it using a nice flat sanding block, and then I can use my template to trace out the outline. Now, the outline here is a little bit raggedy, you can see that. That's not a big problem because I'm going to be using sanding machines that will produce a nice fair curve and get rid of any little eccentricities or bumps. However, the diameter there for the sound hole, I want to make sure that's nice and clean, so I've got a good firm line to sand right up to. When bandsawing really thin material like this, sometimes it's a good idea to make an auxiliary table that will clamp to the top of the bandsaw, so there's no space around the blade and no chance for tear out underneath the front edge of the cutting. Here I'm using the oscillating spindle sander to do the inside curves. The outside curves are more easily done on a nice flat disc sander. And of course there'll always be some hand sanding left to make things the way I want them. I'm softening all the margins by sanding in a chamfer. This will ease the transition onto the soundboard and make things look a little more finished. I can do my final sanding up to about 1200 grit. And the back surface of the guard I'm protecting with plastic packing tape. The surface that will eventually receive glue, I don't want any oil on that. So this is polymerized tung oil based finish. And you just put it on, wipe off any excess, let it dry, and continue. Actually, the first coat I sanded in using some micro mesh for a smoother result. And the main thing is you do definitely want to get rid of all of the excess oil before you let it sit. I put on about 6 coats, let it dry for a week, and it was ready to buff. Buffing is one of those things, it takes a little practice to get the hang of. So you see I've got a piece of plywood there as a backer, so I can present it to the work and not have to worry about it bending. If you don't know what you're doing, you can catch the leading edge of an object on the buffing wheel. You'll want to grab it and tear it out of your hands because the buffer is moving away from you. So it has a tendency to throw things on the floor if you're not careful. So it's good to practice this sort of thing. I'm using a brown Tripoli compound, and it'll make a nice sheen. The compound leaves a waxy sort of haze, which I'll need to buff off with a piece of cotton, do a little bit of burnishing. That buffed up really nicely. Now this is an oil-based finish with open pores, so you're never going to get a super high gloss out of it, but what you do end up with is this lovely satin, lustrous sheen. Feels great to touch. It's good stuff. Now if you wanted a super high gloss finish, you could, instead of using the oil, flood the entire surface with CA glue, like super glue, block sand in between coats, and make sure it's good and flat, and then buff that up. And you'd end up with something that's more like plastic. But I think this is going to please my customer. And in terms of actually affixing it to the guitar, the way I would do that is obviously peel off the plastic we've got on the back there for protection. Take it to a piece of cardboard or something and flip it over, give it a spray with the old 3M Super 77, which is a spray adhesive. Let it flash off for about 20 seconds or so, and then find the position you want around the sound hole, and then just press and play at that point. It's pretty simple. The Super 77, in my experience, sticks well to all the the common finishes. Does well on urethanes, lacquers, shellac. If you at some point need to take it off again, it comes off with some heat. But other than that, it's good, strong, perfect for this kind of application. Anyway, that's it for today. Thanks for watching, and I will see you again soon.